Continuing now with F.F. Bruce's the Canon of Scripture. So in our last session, we finished part 3. So far we have read through part 1, which was introduction, and had only one chapter titled Holy Scripture. Part 2, Old Testament, which had 6 chapters, the Law and the Prophets, the Greek Old Testament, the Old Testament becomes a new book, the Christian canon of the Old Testament in the East and in the Latin West, and before and after the Reformation. Part 3, which we just finished in our last session, was titled New Testament, and it had 13 chapters. Writings of the New Era, Marcion, Valentinus and his school, the Catholic response, the Muratorian fragment, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Novatian, Tertullian, Cyprian, and others, the Alexandrian Fathers, Eusebius of Caesarea, Athanasius and after, the West in the 4th century to Jerome, Augustine to the end of the Middle Ages, and the chapter that we just finished in our last session, chapter 20, the New Testament canon in the age of printing. And now we have reached part 4, which is titled Conclusion. It has 3 chapters, Criteria of Canonicity, which will begin in just a moment, a canon within the canon, ? And the final chapter, chapter 23, which is Canon, Criticism, and Interpretation. So now we begin part 4, Conclusion, with chapter 21, Criteria of Canonicity. Tests in the Apostolic Age. The earliest Christians did not trouble themselves about criteria of canonicity. They would not have readily understood the expression. They accepted the Old Testament scriptures as they had received them. The authority of those scriptures was sufficiently ratified by the teaching and example of the Lord and his apostles. The teaching and example of the Lord and his apostles, whether conveyed by word of mouth or in writing, had axiomatic authority for them. Criteria of a kind, however, were found to be desirable quite early. When prophets, for example, claimed to speak in the Lord's name, it became necessary to, quote, discern the spirits by which they spoke. Some members of the church were given, quote, the ability to distinguish between spirits, 1 Corinthians 12:10. According to Paul, the decisive criterion to apply to prophets is their testimony to Christ. Quote, no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit, 1 Corinthians 12:3. Somewhat later, John suggests a more specific test. Quote, every spirit which confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God, 1 John 4:2. Such tests anticipated the later insistence on orthodoxy as a criterion of canonicity. Again, when Paul suspected that letters were circulating in his name which were none of his, he gave his friends a simple criterion by which his genuine letters could be recognized. Although he regularly dictated his letters to amanuensis, he took the pen himself to write the final greetings, sometimes, but not necessarily, accompanied by his actual signature. And it cites here 1 Corinthians 16:21, Galatians 6:11, Colossians 4:18, 2 Thessalonians 3:17, also Philemon 19. Paul's handwriting was evidently so distinctive that it could not be easily forged. This was, of course, a temporary criterion of authenticity. No document containing Paul's handwriting has survived to our day, and even if one had survived, the handwriting would not be recognizable as his at this late date. Apostolic authority. Since Jesus himself left nothing in writing, the most authoritative writings available to the church were those which came from his apostles. Among his apostles, none was more active in writing, as well as otherwise, than Paul. There were some in Paul's own day, and a few in later generations, who questioned his right to be called an apostle. but throughout the churches of the Gentiles his apostleship was generally undoubted, inevitably so because a number of those churches would not have existed except for his apostolic ministry. And footnote says, see Paul's argument in 2 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3. The existence of the Church of Corinth was the only letter of accreditation he needed at Corinth. The authority of his authentic letters continued to be acknowledged after his death, not only by the churches to which they were severally addressed, but by the churches as a whole. It is not surprising that Paul's letters were among the first, if not absolutely the first, of our New Testament documents to be gathered together and to circulate as a collection. Letters in antiquity normally began with the writer's name, and so did Paul's letters. But many of the New Testament documents do not contain the writer's names. They are strictly anonymous, to us completely anonymous. The writer to Theophilus was well enough known to Theophilus, see Luke 1:3 and Acts 1:1, but his name has not been preserved either in the third gospel or in Acts. To us, therefore, these two works are anonymous. Traditionally, they are ascribed to Luke, but if we wish to examine the validity of this tradition, we have to consider which Luke is meant, and what the probability is of their being the work of that Luke. Similarly, the recipients of the letter to the Hebrews, no doubt, were well acquainted with its author. In that sense, they would not have regarded it as an anonymous communication. But since it does not bear his name, his identity was forgotten after a generation or two and has never been certainly recovered. From the 2nd century onward, 2 of the 4 Gospels were ascribed to apostles, to Matthew and John. Whether Marcion knew of this ascription or not, we cannot say, but if he did, that in itself would have deprived them of all Christian authority in his eyes. These 2 men belonged to the group which he believed had corrupted the pure message of Jesus. An eccentric churchman like Gaius of Rome might ascribe the 4th Gospel to Cerinthus, but the views of eccentric churchmen have never disturbed the general consensus. It is remarkable, when one comes to think of it, that the 4 canonical Gospels are anonymous, whereas the Gospels which proliferated in the late 2nd century and afterwards claimed to have been written by apostles and other eyewitnesses. Catholic churchmen found it necessary, therefore, to defend the apostolic authenticity of the Gospels which they accepted against the claims of those which they rejected. Hence come the accounts of the origin of the canonical 4 which appear in the Muratorian list, in the so-called anti-Marcionite prologues, and in Irenaeus. The apostolic authorship of Matthew and John was well established in tradition. But what of Mark and Luke? Their authorship was also well established in tradition, but it was felt desirable to buttress the authority of tradition with arguments which gave those 2 Gospels a measure of apostolic validation. As early as Papias, Mark is said to have set down in writing Peter's account of the sayings and doings of the Lord, and Peter's apostolic authority was not in doubt. As for Luke's Gospel, its author was early identified with the man whom Paul calls Luke, the beloved physician, Colossians 4:14. This meant that he was one of Paul's associates, and something of Paul's apostolic authority rubbed off on him. Tertullian says of Luke, not an apostle, but apostolic. Some, identifying Luke with the unnamed brother of 2 Corinthians 8:18, quote, whose praise is in the gospel, went so far as to see in these words of Paul a reference to the gospel of Luke, if they did not indeed go farther still and see a reference to it in Paul's mention of, quote, my gospel, in Romans 2:16, 16:25, and 2 Timothy 2:8. Fortunately, the value of Luke's gospel can be vindicated with stronger arguments than these. But the fact that these were the arguments used in its defense in the 2nd and 3rd centuries shows how important some degree of apostolic authorization seemed to be for the books which the Church accepted as uniquely authoritative. The fortunes of the letter to the Hebrews provide a further example of the importance attached to apostolic authority, if not authorship. Those who, like the Church of Alexandria, accepted this letter as the work of Paul, recognized it without more ado as canonical. If someone with a critical faculty like Origen's realized that, As it stood, this document was not Paul's work. A way around this offered itself. The Greek text indeed was not Paul's. Perhaps it was Luke's, but a Hebrew work of Paul lay behind it. An even better developed critical faculty might have indicated that Hebrews was not written in translation Greek. Those who, like well-informed members of the Roman Church, knew that the work was not Paul's, esteemed it highly as an edifying document handed down from the early age of the Church, but did not accept it as apostolic. When at last, in the 4th century, the Church of Rome was persuaded to fall into line with the other churches and recognize Hebrews as canonical, a natural tendency followed to treat it as Pauline also, but Pauline with a qualification. I am moved rather by the prestige of the Eastern churches, said Augustine, to include this epistle too among the canonical writings. But he had reservations about its authorship. Like his older contemporary Jerome, he distinguished between canonicity and apostolic authorship. Even at an earlier period, apostolic authorship in the direct sense was not insisted on, if some form of apostolic authority could be established. Membership of the Holy Family apparently carried with it near apostolic status. Paul indeed seems to include James, the Lord's brother, among the apostles, Galatians 1:19. But so far as James was concerned, there was the further consideration that to him, as to Paul himself, the Lord had appeared in resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15:7. If therefore the James who names himself as author of the letter addressed to, quote, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, was identified with the Lord's brother, that was good enough reason for accepting the letter among the apostolic writings. And if Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, was indicated in those words to be another member of the Holy Family, that was sufficient to tip the balance in favor of accepting the short letter so superscribed, especially in view of the, quote, words of heavenly grace, of which, as Origen said, it was full. The early church knew several works claiming the authority of Peter's name. A footnote says, in addition to the canonical epistles of Peter, there are the Gospel, Acts, Apocalypse, Judgment, and Preaching of Peter, the Epistle of Peter to James in the Pseudo-Clementine literature, and the Epistle of Peter to Philip, one of the Nag Hammadi treatises. Among these, no difficulty was felt about 1 Peter. Its attestation goes back to the first half of the 2nd century, and it was handed down as one of the undisputed books. And the footnote adds, this statement is not affected by its omission from the Muratorian list, which is a problem on any dating of the list. There was considerable hesitation about 2 Peter, but by the time of Athanasius, it was no longer a disputed book in the Alexandrian Church or in Western Christendom. Its explicit claim to be the work of the Apostle Peter was probably felt to be supported by the fact that it contained nothing unworthy of him. Among the Johannine writings, 1 John was also, Johannine writings, 1 John was always closely associated with the fourth gospel. If the gospel was acknowledged to be apostolic and canonical, so was this epistle, although it was as anonymous as the gospel. Those who doubted the apostolic authorship of 2nd and 3rd John and the Apocalypse tended to doubt their canonical status also. The disinclination to accept the Apocalypse was due not mainly to doubts about the identity of the John who wrote it with John the Apostle. It was due much more to the antipathy which was widely felt in the Greek world to its millenarianism. Dionysius of Alexandria, who ascribed it on grounds of literary criticism to another John than the apostle and evangelist, acknowledged it to be a genuine work of prophecy. Two aspects of the apostolic criterion were themselves used as subsidiary criteria, antiquity and orthodoxy. Antiquity. If a writing was the work of an apostle or of someone closely associated with an apostle, it must belong to the apostolic age. Writings of later date, whatever their merit, could not be included among the apostolic or canonical books. The compiler of the Muratorian list had a high regard for the Shepherd of Hermas. He recognized it evidently as a genuine work of prophecy. However, it had appeared too late to be included among the canonical prophets. and equally it had appeared too late to be included among the apostolic writings, for it was written only the day before yesterday, so to speak. This argument could have been employed more freely than it was in settling problems of authenticity, at a time when so many works were appearing which claimed to have been written by apostles and their associates. But perhaps most of the churchmen who concerned themselves with this problem lacked the information or the expertise to appeal confidently to the evidence for dating such documents. They preferred to judge them by their theology. Orthodoxy. In other words, they had recourse to the criterion of orthodoxy. By orthodoxy, they meant the apostolic faith, the faith set forth in the undoubted apostolic writings and maintained in the churches which had been founded by apostles. This appeal to the testimony of the churches of apostolic foundation was developed especially by Irenaeus. Whatever differences of emphasis may be discerned by modern students within the corpus of New Testament writings, these are irrelevant to the issues which confronted churchmen of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They had to defend the apostolic teaching, summed up in the rule of faith, against the docetic and Gnostic presentations which were so attractive to many in the climate of opinion at that time. When previously unknown Gospels or Acts began to circulate under the authority of apostolic names, the most important question to ask about any one of them was, what does it teach about the person and work of Christ? Does it maintain the apostolic witness to him as the historical Jesus of Nazareth, crucified and raised from the dead, divinely exalted as Lord over all? A good example of the application of this test is provided by the case of Bishop Serapion and the Gospel of Peter. When Serapion found that this document was being read in the church of Rosas, he was not greatly disturbed. He certainly did not examine its style and vocabulary, as Dionysius of Alexandria might have done, to see if its claim to be the work of Peter or a product of the apostolic age was well-founded or not. But when he discovered that its account of the Lord's death was tinged with docetism, it implies that he did not really suffer. Then he decided that he ought to pay the church of Rosas a pastoral visit to make sure that it had not been led astray by this heterodox teaching. Other Petrine, so we have Pauline, the works of Paul, and we have Petrine, the works of Peter. Other Petrine literature circulating among the churches was equally unauthentic, but since it did not inculcate heresy, it caused no great concern. The Muratorian compiler, for example, seems to draw upon the Acts of Peter, which gave an account of the apostles' Roman ministry and execution, and he expressly includes the Apocalypse of Peter in his list, although he concedes that some refuse to let it be read in church. And in footnote, he says, according to the church historian Sozomen, writing between 439 and 450, the Apocalypse of Peter was read in his day on Good Friday in some Palestinian churches. But in due course, the non-apostolic character of these works became sufficiently evident to ensure that they did not find a permanent place in the New Testament canon. It is doubtful if any book would have found a place in the canon if it had been known to be pseudonymous. The Acts of Paul, one of the earliest exercises in Christian novel writing, dating from shortly after the middle of the 2nd century, was orthodox enough, and indeed quite edifying, especially to those who believed that celibacy was a superior state of life to matrimony. It was not pseudonymous, for its author was known, but it was fictitious and unworthy of the great apostle, for love of whom it was said to have been written. The author was therefore deposed from his office as presbyter in one of the churches of Asia. Anyone who was known to have composed a work explicitly in the name of an apostle would have met with even greater disapproval. Catholicity. A work which enjoyed only local recognition was not likely to be acknowledged as part of the canon of the Catholic Church. Again, we're talking lowercase Catholic here, lowercase c Catholic. On the other hand, a work which was acknowledged by the greater part of the Catholic Church would probably receive universal recognition sooner or later. We have seen how the Roman Church ultimately consented to receive Hebrews as canonical, so as not to be out of step with the rest of Orthodox Christendom. It might have been argued that the letters of Paul were too local and occasional in character to be accepted as universally and permanently authoritative. The issues to which he addressed himself in the letters to the Galatians and the Corinthians, for example, were of temporary urgency in the churches to which those letters were sent. How could their inclusion among the scriptures of the Catholic Church be justified? The earliest answer given to this question was one which was evidently found satisfactory at the time, although to us it seems curiously far-fetched. It was this. Paul wrote letters to 7 churches, and in view of the symbolic significance of the number 7, that means that he wrote for the Church Universal. The same conception of 7 as the number of perfection was applied to the 7 churches addressed in the Apocalypse. Indeed, the compiler of the Muratorian list preposterously regards John as setting the precedent in this regard, which Paul followed. In both sets of letters, what was written to 7 was spoken to all. Even Paul's letters to individuals have an ecumenical reference, says the Muratorian compiler. Quote, "They have been hallowed for the honor of the Catholic Church in the regulation of ecclesiastical discipline." End quote. Each individual document that was ultimately acknowledged as canonical started off with local acceptance. The various epistles in the places to which they were sent, the Apocalypse in the 7 churches of Asia, even the Gospels and Acts in the constituencies for which they were first designed. But their attainment of canonical status was the result of their gaining more widespread recognition than they initially enjoyed. And we'll stop here in the middle of a chapter on criteria of canonicity and take up there in the next session. Thank you for watching.